Hello. All right, so here we are with the War for Independence exercise, and hopefully you will have time to take a look at the video, the pre-recorded video that I have already. It's pretty specified regarding that which you need to be armed to do well on it. All right, and so for instance. It starts off with an introduction to the context. You know, however you're going to decide to interpret a given event is going to dictate largely what you consider as vital context, right? Surrounding situation information. But in this War for Independence, what I try to do, having gone over multiple interpretations, is I try to put it all together and try to put that which seemed to be most salient, it really stood out amongst the different books I've come across regarding context and what's important as vital information, etc. So at any rate, let's see here. So I'm trying to multitask here. Let's see here. So if you have your assignment with you or on you, I'm going to go ahead and open it to that. All right. And we're going to take a look at it together. But again, I'm going to be a little bit limited in what I cover, knowing that I cover it relatively thoroughly in the video, which I'd like you to watch. All right. Oh, okay. Okay, Mr. Let's see, Farheen Shah. Okay. Okay, I'm sorry. I feel like I've been here again. I'm trying to catch up with your assignments. I'm 2/3 done with the latest assignment that you've done. And by all means, I'd invite you to remind me because I think, okay, I've done Native Americans, Black Legend with the Spanish, Southern colonies. Now I'm almost finished with Northern colonies. But I need to be reminded to go back to the prior assignments and look for those who are turning it in for partial credit. And it never hurts to send me a Canvas message. Okay, thank you. Sure. All right. So I duly received from Hafsa. Let's see here. But if you could, please use the primary means. I always have a hard time accessing my emails, my regular emails. If you could, it's so much easier for me if you could get a message to me via Canvas message. If that's possible, that'd be great. But I will do the work in accessing my email to take a look in those two cases that I've just been apprised of. All right. And so, and I always dot my I's and cross my T's when it's time for the final grades. I go back through all of the assignments to make sure there aren't any, lately submitted ones. In some cases, there was a mix-up with with that which was turned in, and so you didn't get a 0. I just put an X on my Excel sheet, and I know to go to back to that assignment and check it out once you've done that. All right. So, all right, I'm making notes for myself, and let's see here. So that's duly noted. And yeah, I just don't know a quicker way, you guys, to do this. There are a lot of those present. It's a great problem to have. But it's just takes a while. Okay, so I'm done now, finally. And so I'm going to share the page if I can. See here. So here's the assignment, and it gives you a general introduction to that which is considered to be contextual information that's vital to remember when you look at our War for Independence. from 1775 to 1783 against England and Great Britain. As of 1707, Great Britain had been formed with Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and then the Empire part of the British Commonwealth, the Northern colonies, and Canada at the end of the French and Indian War, and then also India. So at any rate, the British Empire was pretty mighty, but they were proud of the fact that King George III is going to complain when we began protesting, contending, kind of challenging us to look anywhere else in the world at a colonial society that is colonized by a mother country, in which they have more opportunities and more rights, etc., than we had. And so that goes in line with an interpretation that's popular, known as salutary neglect. The salutary neglect thesis states that it likens us to spoiled children, and Mother England was always gone, oftentimes attending to bigger, greater, more pressing concerns and issues. And we virtually neglected. It had a salutary or healthy effect upon us. And we began doing as we wanted. And we began defying mercantilist restrictions and doing what we wanted economically. And we began demanding and acquiring a political voice that was never really initially intended by Mother England. So that at the end of the French and Indian War, Mother England comes home and says, basically, okay, we're going to have some rules established in this house, and you're going to abide by them now. And then, of course, the proverbial American kids have done so well for so long, they've tasted a good thing for long enough that they say, sorry, Mom, that's not going to happen. We're accustomed to these liberties and rights and powers, and we're not going to relinquish them. So that oftentimes is tied to an English perspective of the American War for Independence, that we were spoiled brats that had it too well for too long and fought to keep a good thing going. You'll find that and you'll find more details about it in I believe it's number 1. Yeah, number 1. So please be sure to read all these, okay? Even though you're going to choose just one to write on, you need to know them for the test. So that's what you need to know as an overview for number 1. And then take a look at this contextual information, demographic boom, ambiguity regarding what exactly was entailed in our subject rights. That was the term for citizenship, the closest thing they had to it in the early modern era. And so what did it exactly entail to have subjectship rights under Mother England? That was ambiguous. So take a look in the introduction. Then also, we did not carry our weight. We did not carry our weight in the French and Indian War. Not a single colony gave the number of soldiers that were asked of it to fight against the French in the French and Indian War, fought primarily here in the New World, but also in Europe. Tax money, tax revenue did not meet British standards. And we even had a very highly publicized practice of smuggling with the French, the enemy, right? In the Caribbean in particular. And so the English, to them, to the Tories, to the Conservative Party, they're like, these American ingrates. They have, when you look at number 1, they've acquired assemblies and assemblymen who have gained more and more power over not only the royal council, but also even the royal governors. And they are clearly thumbing their nose at mercantilist restrictions as to who could trade in what commodities with the proper paperwork, etc., the British customs officials, the highway patrolmen, if you will, were not doing their job. And there's lots of paperwork to convey that. And so oftentimes they even accepted bribes from Americans to trade in whatever they wanted without the proper British paperwork. And so finally, right, the British decide something's got to change. And so the British try to put their foot down, metaphorically, on the Americans. You have here relevant facts. So mercantilist restrictions were denied from 1688 to 1763. Non-enforcement of the Navigation Acts. There was widespread smuggling. The assemblies accumulated much power, and I give specifics on that in section number 1. But also there was socioeconomic strife going on amongst the colonists. They were not unified prior to this war. The Paxton Boys, the regulators in the Carolinas, Howard Zinn has paperwork on New York and Pennsylvania having problems with the rich versus the poor, and having problems with the constituents versus their elected assemblymen. And so it was far from just a monolithic narrative of just united Americans against the British. Even in the midst of the war, right? People still kind of adhere to John Adams' estimation that about 1/3 of Americans were pro-rebellion, calling themselves patriots. About 1/3 stayed loyal to England as Tories, in line with the Tory party, the Conservative Party that wanted to put Americans in their place. And about 1/3 seemed to be indifferent. So at any rate, requisitions for soldiers and money, as I just mentioned, strategy and performance, there was drama there. Then the British, you see here at the end of the French and Indian War, became indebted 137 million shillings. So there was a component to taxing the American colonists that was merely practical, right? And not meant as anything ideologically important. So George III, it doesn't help that he was a young man and prideful, and he had a bit of an insecurity complex because he was the grandson of the first German king of England. And so people sometimes resented his dynasty as foreigners on the English crown. And so he felt like he had something to prove. So at any rate, yeah, you have Pontiac's Rebellion. And so they're trying to get Americans to help fight with British redcoats against Native Americans. And then once they do, at the end in 1763, then he decides with a proclamation of 1763 that the Native Americans are entitled to their lands and American settlers have to stay off of them. And to a lot of Americans, heading west and squatting on, albeit Native American land, constituted their avenue to the American dream, so to speak. And that was cut off from them by this royal proclamation. All right. And then you have, so let's see here, the proclamation of 1763, I just mentioned, they couldn't pass Appalachia, or the Appalachian Mountains. The Sugar Act said absentee customs officials, you must return to your post and do your job. If someone does not have the proper paperwork for trading in a certain commodity, you are to fine or even arrest them. So now they're trying to enforce the rules when arguably those rules were not well enforced, according to the textbook I usually use in many books, Paul Johnson, etc. So then also you had to have official papers for merchants and ships. Then the Vice Admiralty Courts is where you went to be tried as a smuggler. They increased their jurisdiction and they gave certain papers of writ, that WRIT, kind of like a the word is eluding me, like in modern parlance, when you have the right to just stop a ship at will and check on board and to see if there's any contraband on it. All right. As you see there, Navy granted a general writ to inspect American ships. This was seen as an intrusion upon Americans' privacy, on their livelihood, right? Then enumerated goods, goods that were specifically stated to be special to the crown and to have a special tax upon them, hides, iron, timber, were increased to more commodities. New customs duties were added to foreign cloths, sugar, indigo, coffee, wine. Okay, so this is hitting the pocketbook, particularly of merchants, of American merchants. And in having to pay those fines, they would have to raise the price of their commodity. And so it hit consumers as well, having to pay more for the finished product. Let's see here. 8 colonial assemblies petition economic injury. So you see, so far, it sounds a lot like the British perspective, that this was about money, not about rights. This is about convenience. The Americans had had a good thing going, the whole salutary neglect thesis. All right. Smuggling. New York smugglers paraded informer George Spencer with human feces upon him and forced him to leave the Newport Mercury ship. There was a sword fight and a colonial man lost his life. There was the Gaspé affair up in the Northeast, where they stopped an American ship, and the people on the American ship fought and attacked the customs officials' ship, their small boat, and sunk it. 1764, a Currency Act. Colonial paper was now prohibited. We couldn't print our own money. We had to stay on the shillings and pound system of Mother England. So a lot of economic oriented stuff. But Colonel Isaac Barr, he gave a speech in Parliament, and he said basically, he warned, this is back in England, obviously, he warned the Tories, the conservatives, and said basically that to Americans, it's going to be symbolic, that it's not about a few extra, shillings that they have to pay for this or for that, or the inconvenience of having to try to acquire the proper papers to engage in a given economic transaction. But he says to them, that's beside the point. To them, he said, it's going to be symbolic, that they have grown to consider those economic practices as their God-given and British rights. And once we began even slightly infringing upon them, they're going to take it with alarm, and they're going to fight to the death to keep them. And it seemed to be a little bit prophetic. And so Virginia's House of Burgesses, at this time, Patrick Henry, a young assemblyman in Virginia, became famous when he jumped up and said that this is treasonous from the crown. And by the way, this was passed by Parliament, not King George III, the king. But he directed his ire toward the king and said that just what Isaac Barr had said, that it's the symbolic point that they were once enjoying these rights, and now that the British king was taking them away one by one, that the result was going to be tyranny unless they stood up and fought. And that if the king continued to behave in this manner, he was going to find an untimely death. And of course, someone stood up and said that's treasonous. So at any rate, Patrick Henry became, late in a few subsequent years, seen as a heroic, defiant figure for the colonies. Rhode Island, their assembly, met together and decided that the Sugar Acts and these acts imposed upon the colonies were unconstitutional, against the British Constitution. Massachusetts was provoked by Otis's submission and Hutchinson's private letter to Governor Bernard. Hutchinson was a royal governor of Massachusetts, and he sent a letter saying that there needs to be a squashing, if you will, upon the people of Massachusetts, because in Massachusetts it had become known throughout the several colonies that that defying the mercantilist laws in the tax laws was most pervasive, arguably, in Massachusetts. So Hutchinson, their own governor, sent a secret letter and says that we need to squash the Massachusetts people. And Benjamin Franklin, of all people, got a hold of that private letter and publicized it. And so the people were furious with their own governor. The Stamp Act Congress, 9 states, 9 assemblymen from 9 different colonies met together and said they will not collect any tax within their own colonies that has not first had the approval of their elected colonial assemblymen. So hence that Parliament cannot just simply impose its will without the colonial assembly's permission. Now, remember, the British Constitution, the English Constitution, is organic. It was not written down. It was followed a series of traditions, decisions by courts, parliamentary laws passed, royal decrees. And so there was room for ambiguity, right? But it was kind of thought, the way we do with our judiciary, that once certain decisions are made and they're followed for a number of years, that it has become precedent that you are to follow and allowed to enjoy. Well, that was the assumption made by Benjamin Franklin and some of the voices of our rebellion, and saying, hey, when you guys read number 1, you'll see some specifics on powers that the assemblies acquired during the colonial period. And Benjamin Franklin said, hey, and this year, the Massachusetts Assembly gained the power to control the salary of the governor, or to give its, or to bring forth legislation for taxation, that it has to come from them, the elected colonials. And so you see there at the bottom, Parliament is going to respond back and saying in the Declaratory Act that what Parliament virtually represents the American people, not literally, because we didn't elect anyone to Parliament, right? But that Parliament virtually represents the American people, and that therefore, because what they did is they did it by demographics. They had made sure that someone represented poor farmers in Parliament, someone represented bourgeois merchants, someone represented artisans, that as long as you had someone from your demographic sitting in Parliament, then you were virtually represented by someone from your same background. But the Americans were not buying that. We wanted literal representation. But they announced with the Declaratory Act, this is the beginning of the schism, where it's clear we're not going to agree that Parliament represents us. So then the Sons of Liberty, the Daughters of Liberty, they began boycotting after the Stamp Act, any printed materials, anything under the Sugar Act, they refused to buy. And in the short run, it worked. Several of these, especially the Sugar Act, the Townshend Act, as we're going to get to, the British Parliament changed its mind and gave in to us and said, fine, we'll drop the taxes on these commodities. And partially because money talks. And we put pressure on one another as colonists, that if you were seen as buying British sold sugar, British sold cloth, etc., they would tar and feather you, and they would put a lot of peer pressure upon you to abstain from buying those things and act as if you were a traitor for buying them. So then they tried it again with the Townshend Acts, said, oh, well, in this case, it's just external taxes, not things that are really bought and sold within the colonies, but these are just bought and sold at the ports, right, of entry with international trade. And it didn't work any better. The Americans boycotted, there was some violence, etc. And then the British, to try to scare the Americans, they moved vice admiralty courts into Philadelphia, Boston, and Charleston, 3 seed beds of rebellion, 3 places where violations of the mercantilist restrictions were very, very evident. And they wanted to put Americans on trial for everyone in those cities to see. All right. And then, so Sam Adams, he sent a circular to the colonies and he asked them to form what would later become the Committees of Correspondence, so that when one injury or violation or infringement upon the rights of people in one colony, that news be spread immediately to the other colonies and that they stand by that injured colony. So at any rate, the British Governor Hutchinson of Massachusetts gave an ultimatum to the assembly and said, you are to renounce that circular, that you're dabbling with treason here, trying to provoke the other colonies to join you. And so he made them have a session, and 92-17, in defiance of him, even in his presence, they voted to keep the circular and to keep the communication and the organization of the different colonies together. So it doesn't take long from here for governors to begin giving ultimatums to their elected assemblymen, and the assemblymen literally were dissolved and left and began meeting in taverns and places that were grassroots and technically not organizationally recognized by England. And so now the lines are being drawn. Let's see here. So the Massachusetts Assembly was dissolved, and 2 regiments of British soldiers came from Ireland into Boston. Then the New York Assembly was dissolved. They refused to follow the Mutiny Act. And the Mutiny Act contended that you should allow soldiers, British soldiers, to come into your homes and commandeer any products that they needed, food, clothing, etc. And so in New York, that wasn't flying. And so they were dissolved. So again, now Massachusetts and New York are meeting, the assemblymen are still meeting, but they're meeting in secret, extra legally, because their governors refused to recognize them any longer. And the British government and parliament refused to recognize them. All right, so then notice the duties were repealed by the Prime Minister, Lord North, the taxes that is, except that on tea, to make a statement to us as to who was in charge. And you know where this goes. So then there was the Boston Massacre, and that began with a fist fight between a colonial gentleman and a British redcoat. They were fighting over a job, a side job. And the colonial got the better of him. He went back to the other soldiers. They saw him worse for wear, and they began chasing that guy through the streets of Boston until he went to the Boston commander, because the Boston commander actually had a good reputation for being lenient on the colonists. So he went to the very men he's running from, their boss, to protect him from them, from their wrath. And when he got there, just commotion ensued. Lots of people who didn't know what was going on, bystanders, began getting a bad and hostile feeling from whatever was going on. They began throwing rocks and snowballs and cursing at all the soldiers. And to this day, the British commander contends that he did not give the order, but his men fired into the crowd and killed 5 people. And so the Americans ran with that in their pamphlets, in their newspapers, their almanacs. And that's where you're going to see a number 2, where they begin writing about natural rights derived from the French Enlightenment. And so you have your natural rights to life, liberty, and property, written by Rousseau and John Locke. You have your natural rights when you are suspected of committing a crime, written by Beccaria. You have your natural rights of expression and peacefully protest the government, written by Voltaire. And the list goes on of other things, the right to self-improvement, to not be denied entrance into colleges, into vocational schools, into trades, to be able to go as far as your talents and hard work will allow you to go. And that was Diderot and Condorcet. And so these ideas began being summarized in short, palatable form, because let's face it, right? The average person is not going to sit and read Rousseau's 300-page book on the social contract in French. That's just not going to happen. But Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, John Dickinson, they can. And they could summarize what they read in pamphlets that are oftentimes no more than 30 pages, posters, etc. So these intellectual, middlemen, if you will, they became the intellectual leaders at this time in spreading these ideas of the French Enlightenment to the American colonists in a form in which they had the time to be able to read and were capable of reading with how straightforward and plainly written the verbiage was. And then you also had the Scottish Enlightenment. And the Scottish Enlightenment, I usually sum up with the term libertarian. Libertarian, right? You want the government as small and unobtrusive into your life as possible. You believe that inherently there's something in human nature that mankind cannot handle too much power, that any strong centralized government inevitably will become corrupt and abusive. So you want to keep it limited. Excuse me. So you have that libertarian thought also in this language, in these pamphlets from the Scottish Enlightenment, or excuse me, Whig opposition. Remember, the Whigs, WHIG, were the Liberal Party. So you had two guys named Gordon and Trenchard, who were big leaders of that. And Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, they read their stuff. One of them, I believe Franklin, actually met these guys and directly printed their stuff over here in the colonies. And so you had that. And then a third and final one that's mentioned on number 2 in the court history of American, quote, revolution, that it was a revolution, is the Great Awakening. And with the Great Awakening, it was all about conditional deference. That if you believe, Great Awakening, by the way, is a religious movement in the churches, that if you believe your leaders are no longer following God and God's will, then you have the right to righteously rebel against them. They've lost their worthiness of being deferred to once they have failed to follow God's dictates. All right. And then in 1772, the committees of correspondence are formed. Now, assemblymen from the different colonies are regularly meeting with one another, coordinating with one another, spreading news of what happens in one colony down to the other colonies, etc. And then in 1773, the Tea Act, the English East India Company was granted a monopoly so that they alone could sell tea to the colonists. And remember, there was already a tax on it. And so then the Boston Tea Party ensued. December 16th of 73, the Sons of Liberty chapter came out to the harbor disguised as Native Americans and dumped 10,000 shillings worth of tea into the Boston harbor. So at that time, Parliament and King George III, with his support, are not messing around. They closed Boston Harbor. They chose the councilmen. They remember had already refused to acknowledge the assembly. They shut down the town hall meetings. So now representative democracy is virtually nullified in Massachusetts. There's no local Democrat representative democracy with the town hall meetings, and there's no regional representative democracy with the assemblies, at least not legally recognized. They decided to move the vice admiralty courts overseas. So this was even scarier than putting them in the big cities. So that if you're charged with, violation of the mercantilist restrictions, largely as a smuggler, they're going to take you overseas. And the idea was that your family and loved ones are never going to see you again at that point. And then to the Americans, they thought was a slap in their face, the British Parliament, with the approval of King George III, granted basic rights, participatory rights, and religious toleration to French Catholics in freshly won Canada from France. And so they felt like this was a slap in their face. And British were trying to, they likened it, right, to if you have one misbehaving child, you punish that child and then you reward the other one to see what he's missing, should he decide to behave better. So in September of 74, they met as the First Continental Congress. All of them met except Rhode Island. So 12 of the 13 sent their assemblymen there, and they issued Enlightenment notions. They talked about the Scottish opposition, Gordon and Trenchard, etc. They had in their rhetoric, they had things of the Great Awakening, as far as the loss of credibility of their leaders because they were no longer ruling as God would want. And you also had notions of classical antiquity, and mainly it was to Rome, and they began likening it in their propaganda, the British king and parliament, to sources of tyranny, right? To Julius Caesar being too hungry for power, to some of those awful, Nero and Caligula. Oftentimes they used Caligula to vilify in their propaganda the British. So word gets out that because by this time, not only the colonial assemblies, but also the militias began giving ultimatums to show their loyalty to the British Crown. And so they split. Some of the colonial militiamen signed their loyalty to the British, Great Britain, and stayed under the lordship of their governors to fight for them. And some said, no, I'm with the rebellion, with the patriot cause. Those who chose the latter began boasting in their propaganda that they would be ready at a minute's notice to defend their homes and their families and their neighborhoods and their rights. So hence they began calling themselves Minutemen. And so the British commander was Gage, and he was told that Minutemen were gathering and arming themselves in the area of Concord, Massachusetts. And he was to go confiscate their weapons and arrest them. And if they were to resist, he had the order and the approval of shooting upon them. So he doesn't make it to Concord. He makes it to Lexington. And at the Lexington Green, you had a motley group of people. You had like a 13-year-old boy and a 76-year-old man, and calling themselves Minutemen. And Gage tells them to put down their arms. They refuse. And as with the Boston Massacre, no one supposedly knows who fired the first shot, but they shot into the Americans and they killed like 13 of them on the Lexington Green. But as they went to Concord, they were just minutes too late in capturing a couple of rebel leaders, patriot leaders, like Samuel Adams and John Hancock. And Paul Revere gave his famous ride to try to warn them, right? And he actually was caught, brought off his horse. They looked for any confiscated treasonous material, and thankfully he didn't have anything on him, and they let him go, and he continued his ride after that. And that was not before he gave the message to two other people, a traveling doctor in the middle of the night and a young man who was secretly courting a young woman sneaking out her window. And so he lets those two know, and they passed on the news, and it got to the people at Concord in time to get out. And on their way back to Boston, the British were fired upon in guerrilla warfare fashion by the Minutemen. And I don't remember the number, but they lost a decent number of men marching back to Boston. And by then, the Americans had already taken Rochester Heights, or I'm sorry, Dorchester Heights, and put cannon that they had confiscated from the British atop the Dorchester Heights, and they had Boston surrounded. And so the British are going to evacuate Boston, seeing it as a no-win situation. They went up to Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. And then that's where, by that time, the Second Continental Congress declares, yeah, see, this is in support of the different, yeah. So at any rate, by that time, the die had been cast, as Benjamin Franklin said. So with your handout, I've already described numbers 1 and 2. Number 3, you're going to see, I give it away on the titles, you guys. Number 3, you're going to see a selfish side to George Washington and to his coveting, ambitious coveting of high positions and profit. And when he didn't get his way, when obstacles stood in his way of his ambitions, he acts defiantly. So I almost suggest that number 3 is, would George Washington have led the rebellion had the British given him what he wanted? And of course, that's an open-ended question. We'll never know. But it's revisionist. It's cynical of him. And this is definitely revisionist, cynical of the founding fathers as a whole. As I briefly mentioned, before the War for Independence even began, people wrote letters to the royal British governors, commoners, complaining about their own fellow colonial assemblymen that they had elected into office, saying that they didn't care and didn't tend to their welfare, that they were in there only to enrich themselves, that they were indifferent and poor representatives of them. You have evidence during the Stamp Act rebellion and at other times where people like John Adams, well-to-do John Adams, and others are afraid and voice it in Alexander Hamilton in their writings, that they're afraid of their own colonial poor people, calling them the rabble, the mob, saying that there needs to be order if there's going to be rebellion, that they're just as frightened by their own colonial poor as the British are. So number 4 suggests that those well-to-do, that upper echelon of colonials who served as elected assemblymen and other political positions and did very well economically, that they hijacked this rebellion, that they took it over. So most immediately, so they could control their own poor people and subjugate them, but then use them to fight the British. And that some of the injustices that they had inflicted on their own fellow colonial poor people in propaganda, they used the British as a scapegoat and told their own poor followers that the British were to blame for all their woes and that the British were the true enemy. So hence it served, according to Howard Zinn, as a win-win situation. Save their own tail from the anger and rebellion of the poor, and then conveniently get rid of the one demographic that was higher than them, the British appointed positions, so that they could be the top dog standing at the end of the war. But that in order to get the poor, to keep the poor loyal to them and fighting for them in this long fight, that they needed to concede certain promises to them. All right, so are there any questions? Can I get a thumbs up? You guys feel okay on this? Thank you. All right. So if there aren't any other questions, you guys, I'm going to call it a day. Thank you for coming again. You as well, Brianna. Thank you. Thank you, Danny. Jocelyn. Have a great day. Thank you. Thank you.